So doing this, even if it did cost you a few $100, you would save a ton of money versus going and buying all these things. What's up, Lazy Dog fam? Hope all y'all are having an awesome day. It is Monday, March 3rd here in South Georgia. And on our last video, towards the end of that video, we talked about how around here we're just growing watermelons for fun. We're really not trying to save money by growing watermelons. But on today's video, we're gonna flip the script. So a few videos ago, we had someone comment and ask, what would you grow if you were really growing for survival? If the garden was an absolute necessity, what would you grow in there if times were hard and you really had to hunker down? So I gave that some thought and put together a nice little garden plan that I'll show you here in a minute, going from spring to summer to fall, showing the complete succession of planting that we would do in this hypothetical survival garden. So before we get started with this garden plan and planting schedule, let's lay some basic groundwork here. So we're going to be working with a hypothetical 30 by 35 plot. Pretty much a square plot there, close to it, and I went with that size just because that's the size of all my plots around here. And in that 30 by 35 plot, we're going to assume that we can squeeze 7 rows in there. 7 rows, 4 foot apart, then we've got a little bit of room on the ends there. That way we're not planting right on the edge of the plot. And in putting together this garden plan, I wanted to focus on veggies that had some really bountiful production, maybe some really fast production, some good long-term production. Because this is a survival garden, we need to focus on things that are extremely productive for us. I also wanted to focus on things that had good storage, whether that be dry storage, whether that be something that was really good for canning, something that was really good for freezing. So we want things that we can store and enjoy later in the year. So in general, we're focusing on veggies that give us the most bang for our buck, whether that bang be in actual dollars or in row space in this 30 by 35 plot. Now, as we go through this garden plan, you will notice that there are quite a few things that we normally grow around here that are not in this garden plan. So let me tell you what those are and tell you why. So in this survival garden, we would not be growing sweet corn. As much as I love sweet corn, there's not a ton of nutrition there for the amount of space it occupies. So I love growing sweet corn, but in a survival garden situation, I wouldn't have sweet corn in it. I also wouldn't be growing pumpkins. Now, there are some varieties of pumpkins, like that Seminole pumpkin we grow a lot of, that store for over a year, sometimes 2 years. So it would be a good survival food to be growing, but pumpkins just take up too much space. If we planted some Seminole pumpkins in this 30 by 35 plot, they would quickly consume almost the entire plot. Not to mention just that 4 foot of row space that we would only have allocated for them. And for the same reasons, I probably wouldn't grow watermelon in this survival plot. I really love growing watermelon, as you know, but it's not necessarily a survival food, and it's going to take up more space than we have in this plot. I also wouldn't grow bulbing onions. Now, that's not to say I wouldn't grow any onions, and we'll get to that as we work through this plan, but bulbing onions just take so long down here. We plant them in November and don't harvest until May. That's a long time for something to be occupying space in the survival garden and not giving us a whole lot of food. Yeah, eventually we get a decent amount of food from that big bulbing onion, but we would have to wait way too long to get it. So no bulbing onions in our survival garden. I would also not plant any mustard greens. Love mustard greens. They're usually pretty fast to produce, but they can also be fast to bolt if we get some rapid changes in temperature. So they're not as steady as some of the other greens I would probably put in the survival garden. So no mustard greens. And a few other cool season veggies I probably wouldn't plant in the survival garden. I wouldn't plant any broccoli, just considering the amount of food you get for the amount of space those plants take up. I don't think broccoli would be a good choice. Probably wouldn't plant any cauliflower either. It takes longer than broccoli does, and it's good, it's nutritious, but we're not getting a whole lot there for the amount of space that that plant occupies. And lastly, I probably wouldn't grow any lettuce in the survival garden. Now, lettuce is something that we can succession plant, and we can pack a lot of lettuce in a small space. But if you think about it, you can't really eat lettuce by itself. You could, but most of the time you're going to have to put something on that lettuce. So I was trying to focus on things with the survival garden, things that we could actually eat by themselves if we had to. Alright, so let's get started, and I'm going to throw this graphic up on the screen here to kind of help you all visualize everything. You can see 3 different colors on there. Those are for the 3 different seasons we'll be going through. So green is spring, yellow is summer, and orange is fall. And those dotted lines represent the 7 rows in this hypothetical survival garden plot. And so we'll be going through what's going to be in each of those rows in each of these seasons. And as we go through all this, I'll try to mention some of the varieties that I would plant if we actually did this. So starting out in that first row, in say early to mid-January, I would plant some English peas just like we did out here in one of our garden plots earlier this year. And just based on what I've experienced over the last few years, I would probably grow that PLS 595 variety that we really like. And so growing English peas is going to give us some nice fresh eating, but hopefully also give us enough to where we can put some in the freezer. Then in the second row of the spring garden, say mid-February, I would plant some taters. And I would probably plant that Sharp O'Meara variety. It's not my #1 favorite as far as taste goes, but it tastes pretty dang good. It's really productive, and it stores so well. So considering all those things, that's the variety I would probably go with on that whole 30-foot row of taters. And then in row number 3, maybe shortly after we planted those taters, or maybe even before we planted those taters, I would transplant an entire row of cabbage. You think about just how much food you get from a single cabbage head, it's a lot. And that would be a good thing to plant that time of year when it really wasn't warm enough to plant a lot of other stuff. Go ahead and get some cabbage in the ground, that way we have some nice food in the spring months. And then in row number 4, as soon as we were done with our last frost date, I would plant some squash and cucumbers. I would direct seed those. And the ratio of squash to cucumbers would just depend on personal preference. You could do half and half. I might do about 3/4 squash, 1/4 cucumbers, because we would be growing those cucumbers vertically. Wouldn't need, a whole row of them, or maybe even wouldn't need a half a row of them. And for the squash, I'd probably grow that Grand Prize variety we really like, yellow straight neck squash, good disease resistance. We can really rely on that variety. For the cukes, I probably wouldn't grow a slicer. I would grow a pickling variety because we would want to put some of these, in jars in the pantry, pickle them. So probably grow that Super Max variety we'll be growing this year. And then in row number 5, that's where I transplant some tomatoes and peppers in the spring. Now, peppers aren't traditionally thought of as a survival food, but I think it would be nice to have a couple pepper plants just to give some flavoring and seasoning to some of this stuff we'd be cooking. So I'd probably do most of that row in determinate hybrid tomatoes, maybe the red snapper, even that new Firebird variety, and then just have, say, 3 or 4 pepper plants at the end, a couple King Arthur bell pepper plants, then maybe a poblano, maybe a jalapeno, maybe a serrano plant. Then in row number 6, I would plant some pole limas, probably that King of Garden pole lima variety that we've grown for several years. So we'd be growing these vertically, and we should be able to get a lot for fresh eating, but also some we could put in the freezer. And lastly, for the spring in row number 7, I would grow more pole beans, but some pole snap beans, maybe the rattlesnake or the Kentucky Wonder climbing snap bean variety. Either of those would work. Same concept here, fresh eating, but then we can also can some of these for later. So you can see there, just in the spring season, that's a decent amount of food we'd be producing in this 30 by 35 plot. But as we know around here, not all the things that we're planting in spring are going to like our summer heat, and that's why we have to be prepared to plant something else in some of these rows once the summer heat rolls around. So going back up to the top, once it gets hot, those English peas are going to be toast. Hopefully we will have harvested those 3 or 4 times, got a lot of good production from those. But once it gets hot, those plants are going to get all crispy, so we need to get rid of those, and I'm going to plant some squash and cukes in that spot. Now I know we already planted some of those in row 4 in the spring, but at some point the production of that row is going to decline a little bit. The pests are going to start getting after those plants, so we need to have some more planted to get that continual production throughout the summer months. Then in May, our taters in row 2 will be harvested, and once those are harvested, I would plant an entire row of okra. I would probably plant that dwarf cowhorn variety that we really like, just because you can get so much production off a single plant, and you can let those okra pods get longer so you get more okra per pod. Now some of you might be thinking a 30-foot row of okra is a little much, but I think in a survival situation, it might not hurt to have a little extra okra on hand. You can barter with your neighbors. They might have something you need, and they might want some okra. So having a little extra okra, not going to be a bad thing, because we can have some for trade value. And then in row number 3, once we cut all that cabbage, we're going to plant some sweet potatoes there. Now we can't plant traditional sweet potato varieties in this plot because we only got 4 foot of row space to work with. So we'll have to plant some of those vineless varieties, like the bunch Puerto Rico variety that we've grown in the raised beds the last few years. That or the Vardaman variety would work as well. Some of these more compact varieties are going to work better in our survival garden that has kind of a tight row space. And then in that 4th row, once that spring planting of squash and cucumber starts to decline a little bit, I would plant sweet potatoes there as well. So we would have 2 rows of sweet potatoes in our survival garden plot during the summer months. Now in row number 5, come mid to late July, our tomatoes are going to be toast, and so we need to plant something else there. Our peppers would be fine. We'll ride those all the way until the first frost. Now I told you I wasn't going to plant any bulbing onions, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to plant any onions. And so when we pull out those tomato plants, I think planting some of those Louisiana evergreen shallots would be a great idea. Yeah, they don't get very big, but they grow and multiply so vigorously. Lots of green onion tops. We can harvest those little white onion bulbs at any time. And so we'd have plenty of onion material there to work with, and we get it so much faster. We don't have to wait 7 months or more like we do on a bulbing onion. Now in row number 6, hopefully those pole limas are continuing to produce for us into the summer months a little bit. Now it eventually will get too hot and they'll start dropping blooms. Some people will let them hang out, and then they'll sometimes make a resurgence in the fall and start producing again. It doesn't always happen, but it can happen. But we're going to just hope our pole limas are kicking for us a little bit into the summer. Same thing with row 7 in the pole snap beans. We're going to hope those are continuing to produce for us a little bit into the summer. Now once things start to cool down as we get into fall, we're going to want to plant some more cool season veggies in some of these rows. So going back up to the top there, once that summer planting of squash and cukes has kind of seen better days, we're going to plant some cool season stuff in that row, and I think collards and kale would be great. Maybe 3/4 of the row in collards, 1/4 of the row in kale, just based on my personal preference. And so I would probably go with the flash variety on the collards, just because it hangs around so long and is so productive. And with the kale, I wouldn't plant any dinosaur or lacinato kale. I would plant curly kale, probably that darker board variety. It seems to like to hang around for quite a while. Then in row 2 for the fall, we're just going to keep riding that okra. We're going to let it continue to produce all the way until our first frost date. Now in rows 3 and 4, where we had the sweet potatoes during the summer months, once we harvest those sweet potatoes, we're going to turn around and plant cowpeas in both of those rows. Cowpeas, aka field peas, a lot of different names for these peas, and a lot of different types of cowpeas out there. You got your cream peas, your pink-eyed peas, purple hull peas, crowder peas, those Jack Bay peas we like to grow. Lots of different types of cowpeas that you could grow. They tend to do a lot better for us in the fall than in the spring due to insect pressure. And cowpeas, like a lot of the other legumes we were growing in this plot, you know, you can eat some of them fresh, but you can also freeze some for later. Then in row number 5, we're just gonna let that one ride. We're gonna leave the evergreen shallots there and let those peppers keep growing all the way until our first frost day. And then in row number 6, we need to plant some more cool season veggies there. Hopefully we'll have gotten the goodie out of our pole limas by then. And I think carrots and beets would be perfect for that row. Some nice, dense, nutritious, cool season veggies to grow there. Now, I'm personally not a huge fan of beets, but beets are good for you, and you can beets. That would be a good thing to grow in a survival garden. So I would probably do 3/4 of the row in carrots, probably grow that Miami variety, orange variety that's really consistent for us. And then beets, I don't know, it's been so long since I've grown beets, hard for me to tell you a really good consistent beet variety. And then in row number 7, once we got the goodie out of those pole snap beans, we'll plant some cabbage and rutabagas in that row there. Going back to what I told you earlier, you get so much food from a single head of cabbage. I'd probably plant some Bravo and some Capture cabbage in that row. Bravo matures earlier, Capture a little later. We'd have a nice succession there. And then the rutabagas, you get so much food from a single rutabaga plant as well. You can harvest the greens while you're waiting on that rutabaga to enlarge, and then you harvest that nice big rutabaga. A lot of good groceries there. I would probably just pick a nice hybrid variety like that Eleanor variety we've grown in the past. Now, I didn't break this down cost-wise, what it would cost to do all this, but if I had to take a wild guess at it, I would say you could do this for around a few $100. A lot of it would depend on what kind of seeds you were using. You're going to go with some cheap kind of heirloom open pollinated seeds, or some more expensive hybrid seeds, or you're going to use drip irrigation, and just how hard are you going to push these plants with fertilizer. So you could get pretty frugal with it if you wanted, but I think even if you went all in on it and push these plants pretty hard, you could still pull it off for just a few $100. If you've been to the grocery store lately, you know a few $100 doesn't go very far. Heck, you can go just up the road here to the dollar store, walk out with just a few sacks in your hand, and next thing you know, you've spent 60 or 70 bucks. So doing this, even if it did cost you a few $100, you would save a ton of money versus going and buying all these things from the grocery store. The trick is that you just gotta have a good plan like this and stay on top of it. As soon as one veggie is done or starting to decline, you gotta be ready to clean that out and plant something else. And a lot of what we've chosen to put in our plan has to do with our climate here, what we know grows well, what we're able to grow well. Your survival garden plan may look completely different based on where you live. And if it does, let me know about it in the comments below. What would you substitute in your plan? What would you take out of our list and add in yours? And as always, you can find seeds for a lot of the varieties we mentioned on today's video on our website at lazydogfarm.com. And if you missed our video a few weeks back talking about the one thing you don't want to do when prepping your spring garden, you can watch that right here. We'll go through several good spring garden prep ideas and then tell you about that one thing that will almost always guarantee failure. So check that out, and we'll see you next time right here at Lazy Dog Farm.